Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on blue carbon and freshwater wetlands under gold standard for the global goals. I'm Tom Hayes, your moderator for this session, and I'm excited to have you and our panel here with us today. At Gold Standard, we recognize the critical role of blue carbon ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass meadows as among the most powerful natural carbon sinks we have, but they're also among the most threatened. Every year, we lose about 2% of the world's global mangroves, limiting their ability to sequester carbon, protect coastal ecosystems, and support biodiversity. And that's why we developed our new blue carbon and freshwater wetlands activity requirements, and sitting under that, a sustainable management of mangroves methodology, which was developed in collaboration with Alliance. These key frameworks were released in August last year to ensure that projects are scientifically rigorous, socially responsible, and ultimately deliver high integrity benefits for people, nature, and climate. Today, we'll present these new releases, then through a panel discussion, explore the opportunities and challenges in blue carbon projects, and discuss the critical role of local communities. Then we'll finish with an audience Q&A with the panel and Gold Standard Secretariat. Before we get stuck in, just onto the next slide, a few quick points on housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available online afterwards. And for the Q&A at the end of the session, please put all your questions in the Q&A box. Feel free to upvote questions you'd like to see answered, and someone from the Gold Standard Secretariat will answer in the chat, or we'll put the questions to our speakers. And talking of speakers, to help us explore the impact of blue carbon and freshwater wetland activities, we're joined by an incredible group of panelists who will help us explore the impact of blue carbon activities. And I want to thank them all for joining us from Madagascar, Australia, the Philippines, Dominican Republic. We're bridging multiple time zones, so we really appreciate them joining either first thing in the morning or late at night. And firstly, we have Ashwin, who is a trained forester and manager in our standards development and innovation team, where he's involved in the advancement of standards, methodologies, and tools across agriculture, forestry, and blue carbon sectors. Ashwin has extensive experience as a project developer, as an auditor, and with this experience, he's committed to developing standards and methodologies that align with implementation and local context. Next up, we have Dean Thompson. Dean has over 20 years of experience working on environmental and climate issues and is currently chair of Gold Standard's Land Use and Forestry Technical Advisory Committee. Dean led the development of our blue carbon and freshwater wetlands activity requirements and is a reviewer of new methodologies under Gold Standard, which takes me on to Karen Veridiano, who was co-author of the mangrove methodology developed by Alliance and Gold Standard. Karen is a senior manager at Alliance, where she leads the carbon project development and certification of both terrestrial and blue carbon projects implemented globally under international certification standards. We're also pleased to be joined by two more project developers who are designing projects under the new methodology. Firstly, Lelau Agret, who has a PhD in marine biology and serves as the director of Blue Economy at Bondi International, where she leads the development of a large-scale mangrove ARR project in Madagascar. And last but not least, we have Natalie, who is head of project development for Sequester, a carbon removal project developer that develops and scales nature-based projects by bridging finance and technical gaps for local organizations. For the past 2.5 years, Sequester has worked alongside local partners on the development of a large-scale mangrove restoration project in Nigeria. So you'll be hearing from some of our speakers later on during the panel discussion. But to set the stage, we'll hear from Ashwin, who will provide an overview of the new activity requirements. Then we'll hand over to Karen, who will talk about some of the key features of the new mangrove methodology from her perspective as co-author. So over to you, Ashwin.
Thank you, Tom. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I mean, I guess we have got people from all different time zones here. So as Tom mentioned, I'll be quickly walking you through the activity requirements, BlueCarbon and freshwater wetlands activity requirements. So this was released in August last year in 24. And well, we all know what BlueCarbon essentially refers to. So it's a catch-all phrase to carbon which remains, which is removed and which is stored within the marine ecosystem. And the activity requirements that we have includes both BlueCarbon, that's the coastal and marine ecosystem, as well as freshwater wetlands, that's inland wetlands as well. But before we jump into the technical nitty-gritties or details of BlueCarbon and freshwater wetlands activity requirements, maybe I just would like to touch upon what Tom hinted at on why we even went about developing the BlueCarbon activity requirements. Next slide, please. So as Tom mentioned, I mean, it's a critical ecosystem. The coastal marine ecosystem as well as the inland water ecosystem, they are quite unique, which also serves a lot of SDGs apart from climate change impacts. It could actually go the entire spectrum from livelihood to food security to life on land, where there is impact on life on land as well, where it also has a lot of impact on communities that live around both freshwater as well as coastal ecosystems. So there are a lot of SDG impacts that these ecosystems have, and they're quite unique in the sense they're quite susceptible to changes in climate. And so it brings a unique opportunity to bridge both mitigation and adaptation aspects through these activities, climate activities in water bodies. So these activity requirements that was published last year tries to act as a bridge to both mitigation as well as adaptation activities, and which would also have a high impact, high integrity projects being developed in marine, coastal, as well as freshwater inland water bodies. Next slide, please. So maybe I would like to start with just touching upon the architecture of how activity requirements are placed within gold standard. So within land use and forestry, we have got, as of now, forestry and agriculture components already in place. And at present, BlueCarbon is also within the same framework, even though we have a separate activity requirements for it. And within BlueCarbon, we have all other activities which are eligible within both the different ecosystems that I mentioned, both marine, coastal, as well as inland freshwater wetlands. So activity requirements act as an overarching document which details the eligible activities within that specific sector, and also provides a guideline on how activities that are eligible can undergo a design certification and a performance certification, and can result in SDG impact certificates or impact statements or other products such as GS4GG. So all blue activity requirements, they have to also adhere, they have to be considered in conjunction with the principles and requirements of gold standard, as well as the safeguarding principles and requirements. So they have to be read along with the principles and requirements, and the methodologies, the Mangrove methodology and all other methodologies which would be developed would be part within these activity requirements. Next slide, please. Thanks. So what exactly are the key sectors within the activity requirements? So we have got BlueCarbon. So BlueCarbon again includes mangroves or salt marshes or seagrass meadows and macroalgae, etc., which basically are within the coastal ecosystem or within the marine ecosystem. So all of them are included within the BlueCarbon component. And freshwater wetland basically refers to all the inland water bodies, lakes and rivers and other ponds, etc. And the activities in both these cases will include essentially carbon dioxide removal and storage, or avoidance of methane emissions from these water bodies. So these are the two key components which are eligible, be it marine ecosystem or be it inland ecosystem. So an example of a typical activity, as you all very well may be aware, is the mangrove reforestation activity, but there are other activities as well, which are detailed in section 3 of the activity requirements under table 1. So the table 1 basically gives details of activities that are eligible and those activities which are ineligible. For example, artificial reefs is an eligible activity which could be considered within the blue carbon scope of gold standard. However, natural reefs are not, just to give you an example. And methodologies can be developed under these various sectors, under these various scopes of the activity requirement. And based on the methodologies, activities can also be developed. Next slide, please. Thanks. And here, just to give you a bird's eye view of the layout of the activity requirements document. So the document essentially explains the eligibility requirements, which will have to be considered for any activity which falls within the blue carbon or freshwater wetlands ecosystems. And this would include elements such as a right to carbon dioxide removal, who actually owns the right to it, what are the various considerations to be had, especially when it comes to ecosystem safeguards, what exactly would be the key principles and requirements to consider. So all of those things are explained in the activity requirements. Maybe I just would like to highlight a couple of key considerations here, especially under principles and requirements. So contribution to climate security and sustainable development is one of the key principles which has been highlighted here. So preserving or and increasing the adaptive capacity of the ecosystem is one of the key aspects which has been considered here for all activities. So any activity which will apply these activity requirements and methodologies developed under this will have to also consider adaptation activities, adaptation benefits that actually gets as part of the whole design itself. So any project, any activity that is developed using the methodology, for example, mangrove or any other methodology, is not just a mitigation activity. It shall have adaptation aspects also integrated within the design. That's one of the core requirements of any activity which applies gold standards, BCFW activity requirements. So section 4. 4.1 onwards explains some of the key conditions which one will have to consider when it comes to reporting adaptation impacts, positive adaptation impacts, as well as one may also have to consider risks to such projects due to change in climate. For example, would any rise in sea impact the project adversely? And then one may also have to consider developing appropriate risk mitigation mechanisms. We will also be releasing a detailed guideline on risks and capacities and how they could be evaluated for activities within BCFW framework in the next couple of weeks, so which will also help in understanding how such mitigation mechanisms can also be developed in detail. The activity requirements also, explain some of the methodological requirements, which methodology developers may have to consider. For example, questions such as, do we have to consider different soil organic carbon pools like autochthonous and allochthonous carbon pools? What are the other safeguards which one may have to keep in mind while developing methodology? So some of guidelines on these elements are also given in the activity requirements. Other aspects which one may refer to in the activity requirements includes documentation which would be required for design, a preliminary review of the design, as well as at the time of design certification, what sort of raster layers would be required, and what are those documents which will have to be submitted to gold standard. So those are also explained in the activity requirements. So I think with that, I have given an overview of what activity requirements include and what are the key elements. And maybe what we could do now is to get into more details of the mangrove methodology. So mangrove methodology is parked under the BlueCarbon and freshwater wetlands ecosystem activity requirements. And I would like to invite Karen to walk us through the mangrove methodology. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ashwin, for that preview about the BlueCarbon and freshwater wetlands activity requirements. The next few slides, I will be describing essentially an overview or high-level information about the sustainable mangrove management and sustainable management of mangroves methodology. So, as what previously mentioned, this was formally published alongside the BCFW activity requirements last August. And the very reason, as what Ashwin also mentioned earlier, the uniqueness of mangrove and the different benefit it ensures to local communities also bring forth the reason why we needed to create a separate mangrove methodology, although this has been already included in gold standards afforestation, reforestation methodology from before. However, there are certain uniqueness and complexities alongside the development of mangrove reforestation activity that necessitates a separate methodology to better include and address those types of uniqueness. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the things that maybe we need to discuss within the webinar is about eligibility, although I need to also provide a preview that there is a very specific and detailed stepwise approach or stepwise guidelines that you could find under Appendix 1 of the Sustainable Mangrove Methodology that then guides different project developers and also essentially the general audience on how to conduct the eligibility assessment for this specific methodology. There are 5 different, let's say, areas that you could see on the screen. And what I think the main focus here would be the historical mangrove area. So that's the dotted lines in blue-green color, because that is essentially one of the unique features of this methodology as well, is that we needed to incorporate and also consider that for mangrove reforestation projects to be successful, or at least to reach a certain level of success, we need to ensure that the place itself where the reforestation would happen are still viable or still fit to accommodate the needs, specific needs of the mangrove species that will be planted on those reforestation areas. Hence, there's a very specific requirement for this methodology that eligible areas should be those areas that has been historically classified as mangrove areas. Next slide, please. Other types of key feature designs within this methodology is that it's applicable to all geographies and scales. So whether it's a large, medium, or small or micro scale project, as long as you are compliant with the different requirements of the methodology, then you can apply and use this as specific methodology. And this is especially beneficial to small island states that would have higher risk and vulnerability when it comes to natural disasters and natural occurrences, as well as effects of climate crisis. So another thing that's fairly unique to this methodology is that it has 4 different approaches when it comes to accounting. So we have the remote sensing, field measurement models, and default values. So there's also a very specific description of the different 4 approaches, but I would like to highlight, at least within this slide, that this is one of the innovation that we had to include in this methodology, in a sense, because we want to also enhance transparency and also try to be cost effective when it comes to the succeeding verification events of the project. So we try to incorporate the trend when it comes to utilizing Earth observation images and technologies when it comes to remote sensing, and bridge that with a conventional way of doing forest inventory, especially in mangrove areas that we know are most of the time a bit hard to reach to. So bridging that gap and that complexity, we try to address that by introducing different types of accounting. So, but also still ensuring that there is due diligence, there is a validation that should happen on top of the standard level validation that we usually do for carbon projects. Another thing that is a rather unique or different is that within the methodology, our project developers are required to identify the different drivers and agents of mangrove deforestation. This is, again, another layer of due diligence that we wanted to incorporate, and to also ensure that there's permanence and credibility when it comes to the different mitigation activities that the project developer, project owners are doing and the eligible areas that they are implementing the project. And then at least the last three points: the regulatory surplus, delimiting the eligible areas, and the 30 to 50-year crediting period. Those are already the conventional, let's say, aspects embedded in the previous methodology of gold standard, but there are also flexibility when it comes to how project owners and project developers try to demonstrate these types of aspects that you would see on the last three, let's say, key design embedded within the methodology. And I think this is the end of the slides, as far as I could remember. Yeah. So I bring now back the stage to Tom.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Ashwin, as well for those presentations. I'm keen now to bring in our panel to explore how these documents translate into real world impact. I hope our other panelists have been staying sharp on the guidelines. And just a quick note to our audience, make sure you're sending in your questions in the Q&A box. Karen, I think at one point there you mentioned how the methodology and approaches within the methodology should be cost effective and usable for all project developers. With this in mind, I'm keen to hear from Lalau and Natalie. As project developers implementing mangrove projects under the methodology, I'd love to hear your experience of applying the requirements. And Lalau, maybe we can start with you. Kind of what are the biggest challenges in mangrove restoration, and how can the methodology help to drive effective restoration efforts?
Okay, thank you. Many challenges from the ground. I have been working on the mangrove conservation and restoration project for more than a decade in Madagascar. And Madagascar is low-income country. That means that the livelihood of local community are mainly depending on mangroves. And that is driving to the deforestation and the degradation of mangrove, because the over-exploitation of mangrove for charcoal production, for illegal harvesting of mangrove. The reason of that was the limited alternative livelihood to the communities. The fisheries are collapsing because of the degradation of mangroves, and the community do not have a choice. They have to meet their basic needs, and they have to cut mangrove to meet their basic needs. That is one of the main challenges. And secondly, the land tenure and the resource tenure on mangrove is unclear. And the community do not feel have clear ownership on the land, on the mangrove. and they are not incentivized to protect or restore mangrove. And in addition to that, there is limited funding to support conservation and restoration of mangrove. Many mangrove restoration are supported or financed by short-term donor funding. It lasts for 3 and 5 years only, but mangrove conservation and mangrove restoration require long-term action. This is not only just planting trees and that's it. You need to monitor, you need to assess the health of mangrove, you need to assess if the good and the services provided by mangrove because due to the as results of conservation and the restoration are back to each normal. And in addition to that, there is also lack of governance on mangrove. In Madagascar, as an example, there are several laws governing the mangrove, but the enforcement is so weak. The government of Madagascar sorted local regulation banning the mangrove harvesting across the country, but there is still loss of mangrove. There is degradation of mangrove. That means that there is weak on law enforcement. However, in the mangrove managed by local communities, there is no degradation because community establish their own rule to preserve mangroves. So that is very important. So I think the carbon projects can be a powerful solution to address and to overcome the challenges. I can, as this can provide long-term and sustainable financing through the carbon revenue, which can be used to incentivize local governance and to address community needs. As an example, social infrastructure such as clean water, electrification, promotion of alternative livelihoods or additional livelihoods, in ensuring that communities not only relying on mangrove to meet their basic needs, that they do have additional source of income. That can also, the mangrove restoration and the blue carbon can also reinforce the resilience of the local community against the climate change. Because when mangroves are restored, they can continue to provide their good and services that's for the benefit of the local community. And I think from my experience on the ground, the Blue Carbon project is not only about emission reduction. This is only one piece of the puzzle. The benefits can go beyond the carbon credits, as I mentioned earlier, like enhancing the fisheries, reinforce the social cohesion, because community can make a decision collectively to manage their resources. So in ensuring that the Blue Carbon project is a viable solution to the communities, to the climate, it is, and biodiversity, it is important that the Blue Carbon puts community at its center in ensuring that this is viable solutions. I think that is the voice from the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, our hope is that carbon finance here can provide a sustainable solution for communities reliant upon mangrove ecosystems, especially in the context of addressing drivers and agents of mangrove deforestation. Karen, I'd like to come back to you to build on some of these points. Obviously, there are a lot of things to consider during the design of a project and the design of a methodology. But what would your suggestions be for ensuring a high integrity mangrove project, and which aspects of the methodology kind of directly support this in your view?
Thanks, Tom. I mean, for Alliance is a project developer, but also we were the methodology developer, and so we sort of wear two hats when we were developing the methodology. It's both a privilege to be on that space and to wear those two hats, but it was also enlightening to also be cognizant of the different needs of other project developers who would be using the methodology, and also further emphasizing or leveraging the experience that we had for the last 20, 25 years doing carbon project development. We wanted to not just be compliant with the standard level meaning gold standard level requirements that we already have. For example, the safeguarding principles, the gender equality requirements. So we wanted to further elevate those due diligence that's already in place and include more guidance when it comes to project developers on how to include just what Lalau mentioned earlier, how to include the local communities, both local as they would identify themselves, and also indigenous peoples that are present in the project area. So this is clearly incorporated and explicitly mentioned within the methodology, the different types of guidelines on how you would identify, for example, the drivers of deforestation, and also identifying the SDG impacts, not just about carbon removals that would come from the mangrove reforestation, but other equally tangible and crucial co-benefits that you would get from developing the mangrove reforestation activities. So I would say that within the mangrove methodology, there is a level of guidance to the project developers on how you can go further and beyond the existing widely let's say, recognized core carbon principles, for example, from the ICBCM. There is already that guidance that is provided in the sustainable mangrove methodology on how to incorporate those, but also still providing the project developers the flexibility on how to demonstrate their compliance to this requirement. So we know as project developers, there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of budding or initiating projects out there. And they do have different sets or different levels of skills and capacities when it comes to actually adhering to the requirements of the methodology. And that's precisely the reason why we were very cognizant of the different levels of, let's say, skills and capacity that they have. That's precisely the reason why we filtering through the four approaches when it comes to estimating the above ground biomass. That is to respect and also demonstrate that those project developers that might not have the most sophisticated, let's say, remote sensing capabilities, they can use the approach 3 and 4, which uses default values or IPCC values. However, when they transition to the next verification event, and they do have a bit of revenue coming from the sale of the carbon credits, they can transition to a much sophisticated way of estimating the above ground biomass. So there is that level of flexibility that the mangrove methodology offers, precisely due to the reason that we recognize as project developers that we were not created equal. And so we wanted to be very inclusive in terms of developing the methodology. In a sense, when you combine all of these elements about inclusivity, transparency, using different approaches, and also the due diligence, the additional due diligence that we incorporated that requires a participatory approach when it comes to the identification of drivers of deforestation, as well as the SDG indicators. So this collectively builds upon and also enhances what we call or what we usually term as high quality carbon project. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. And I think you spoke there about being cognizant of other project developers and other people's capacities and kind of going beyond the guidance that's already there to establish best practice. And so, Natalie, as another project developer, I'm keen to hear from you how it's been using the methodology and what have been some of the key highlights and how have you incorporated these aspects into your project design?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think it's a lot of what Karen said, and looking at the methodology in terms of one thing that we really like about the methodology is the mapping and GIS section and just that full framework that it gives you. That's been really helpful as we've designed our project, and I really think that it poises the project for a higher level of certainty in site selection, and ideally combined with some other baseline parameters that we measure a higher level of success in project outcomes. So that's definitely a part of the methodology that we've followed very closely and also found quite helpful. Another part of the methodology that was discussed in the overview that we very much appreciate is the driver's focus, because that takes what we all know to be as a very crucial part of mangrove restoration project development. And it creates that framework for it that's very useful in itself. But on top of that, it also helps us to better frame and present the need for those activities, the countermeasures within the project budget. So it gives us the sort of justification for the inclusion of financing towards those activities alongside of the sort of analysis or assessment approach of it. So we also have really found the driver's focus to be completely invaluable to the methodology. So those are kind of I don't want to touch on anything that's already been covered. So those are kind of two big ones for us. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear that there's some guidance in there that you've been able to kind of take off the shelf and implement within your project. Obviously, we have some quite experienced project developers here, but there'll also be some people in the webinar who are new to blue carbon and freshwater wetland ecosystems. And so, Dean, I was wondering, kind of from a high level perspective, what are some of the kind of key differences between terrestrial ecosystems and blue carbon ecosystems, and what might be some of the opportunities and challenges that newer project developers in blue carbon should address?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, obviously, blue carbon ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems, for that matter, are quite different to the traditional, I guess, terrestrial ecosystems that project developers are currently working in. I mean, all systems are dynamic, but blue carbon ecosystems are very, very dynamic systems dealing with a lot of inherently variable factors, such as tidal regimes and currents and changes in wind due to seasonal climatic factors and variations and so forth. So very different contexts working in the blue carbon and freshwater ecosystem space compared to your terrestrial environment, particularly when you think about the projects that are currently developed under gold standards, such as the reforestation, afforestation projects. And probably to sort of use an example, it's probably an best way of answering this question would be looking at something like macroalgae and looking at reforestation of wild macroalgae, for example, like kelp forests. These are what you would call carbon donor ecosystems, and so within that, or in other words, what that means is they have the potential to export large amounts of carbon to carbon sinks, such as deep ocean sediments. So when you think about that, there's a whole lot of issues that crop up around that we haven't had to face within the terrestrial environment. So there's been research that has found that, as an example of looking at that exportation of carbon to carbon sinks, that the found macroalgae DNA that's found at 4,000 metre depths up to 5,000 kilometres offshore from the coastal environment. So that's suggesting widespread carbon export to open oceans, but that introduces a lot of variability into that. So it throws up a lot of uncertainty around the quantity, location, and permanence of that carbon. So when you're looking at developing a methodology, how do you get around some of that uncertainty? For example, what actually is your project boundary if you're looking at designing a methodology and needing to draw your project boundary, because given that export of carbon to deep ocean sediments, where exactly does your project boundary start and end, so to speak? So there's still a fair few barriers related to the science that we need to get over. There's a lot of science happening in the space. If you're following macroalgae is one of the sort of hot topics in the blue carbon space at the moment. It's through a lot of research that's been done, macroalgae would be considered what they call an emerging blue carbon pathway. At the moment, there's really only 3 actionable blue carbon pathways, and that would be the mangroves, where we see most work being done, and we've got methodologies not just through Gold Standard but elsewhere as well, but also seagrasses and tidal marshes. They're actionable because you can quantify the additional mitigation benefit, impacts around food security are known. We know that they can improve and enhance ecosystems, and that they can be included into policy frameworks and legal frameworks. So that's what kind of the criteria is used to determine whether something's actionable or not. And so at the moment, yeah, as I said, it's really only those 3 ecosystems that are actionable, but a few have been rated as emerging. So macroalgae is one of those. Marine sediments is another, and I think mud flats or tidal flats, as they're also known, is another actionable one, emerging one. Some areas that are non-actionable are things like calcifying ecosystems like artificial reefs, coral reefs, and oyster beds, as examples. So some other going back to the macroalgae example, just to wrap up, some of the other sort of barriers beyond just the science is also around sort of how you manage and account for these ecosystems, and also existing policy and legal frameworks. So when thinking about policy and legal frameworks, and when we start thinking about carbon ownership, if you know these macroalgae ecosystems are exporting carbon offshore up to 5,000 kilometres away, who actually owns that carbon? Because that's well beyond a country's economic exclusion zone. So working through that, I mean, if you're a project developer and there was a methodology out there for wild macroalgae reforestation, how would you determine that you own that carbon and you actually have the rights to the carbon, and that you can assign them or pass them on to the buyer of any such carbon credits that might be generated from those projects? So a few barriers to get over. And I'd say, yeah, if any sort of prospective methodology developers working in this space, I mean, that's definitely something to be working with. So collaborating with the scientists, but also policy and legal frameworks, people working in those spaces, is vitally important to ensure that we can have methodologies that do have integrity and pass the pub test, as we say here in Australia. I'll close there. Hand back to you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. And I think one thing there, obviously, you and the rest of our technical advisory committee spend a lot of time about thinking about project implementation and the utility of methodologies to make sure that they're translated to on the ground action. And part of this is based on the local context of the project, and there are things that we can't always consider. So I wonder from the project developers that we have here, kind of how does the methodology design allow for enough flexibility to incorporate local context, and are there any particular elements of your specific projects that maybe you'd like to highlight in that regard? Maybe Karen, we could start with you and then go to Lalau and Natalie.
Thanks, Tom. Within, the sustainable macro methodology already incorporates that guidance on the different options on how local context and flexibility can be embedded within the project development. So what I could think of is maybe one example would be the soil sampling, let's say, protocol. So that's very specific because that's the top of my head. So project developers, there is in Appendix 2, there are 2 different options that you can use as part of your soil sampling protocol. However, again, as cognizant of the different capabilities of project developers and project owners worldwide, we don't always have the capacity, the resources, and maybe the time to conduct a full-blown soil sampling protocol. And therefore, there is a much more, let's say, localized version of a soil sampling protocol that we can use, incorporating local knowledge or, let's say, participatory approach on doing data collection. And within this methodology, you are still allowed, so there's flexibility for you to apply. And I say apply because it's upon the approval of Gold Standard. The project developers need to apply or need to submit a sort of deviation of the methodology to Gold Standard, and Gold Standard would then decide whether that type of soil sampling protocol is acceptable after, let's say, due diligence checks, and also see if the data collected were actually robust enough to be considered within the calculation. So this very specific types of flexibility are maybe in the fine nose of the methodology, but it exists. And the very reason that those flexibility are there is, again, because we have different types of project developers, we have different types of project owners, and we are not, the projects are not all created in the same way. And so this is one of the things that we needed to include as, for Alliance as the methodology developer for the sustainable mangrove methodology. Yeah.
Lalau or Natalie, would you like to add anything there on how you've been able to cater to the local context?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I just want to, a little bit away from the technical aspect, highlight again how significant the driver's approach and that localized context that the methodology provides has been for us. Just for example, we work in an area where people live alongside the mangroves. Their homes are constructed with mangrove materials. They get up each day and leave their homes, and they go fish in waters that are populated by species that nursery in mangrove roots for their primary livelihood. They then go and smoke these fish using mangrove wood to sell at the market, and they go home and they eat snails and crabs collected and plants collected from the mangrove areas on their dinner tables. So, this is basically a very intrinsic environment to these communities, and our driver's approach completely centers on them and on that aspect. And we very much feel that if we don't involve these communities, not only will the project ultimately fail, but we will also be failing the most important people from the project, because these are the communities that call the mangroves their home. And so who is more important to center in your projects than them? And that driver's approach and how you work through that local context, I'd say that's been very intrinsic for the way that the methodology is flexible for us.
Yeah, absolutely. A community-driven approach is so important here, but not just for the kind of the long-term success of the project, but also for the communities. And Lalau, I was wondering, kind of in your project, how will the communities involved benefit in the long term from the project activity?
Okay, maybe I would like to start on like the flexibility of the methodology. We see that the methodologies are flexible because they allow us to use the local knowledge, which is reflecting the local context rather than as an example. I realize sometimes that the default value is based on from the science from the global north. But for this methodology, we can use the science from the ground or from the specific area where the project is located. That is really important. That's flexibility rather than using default value, which is not always reflecting the local context. And the participatory approach is really, really, really important because that gives like power to the community, good feeling of the community, sense of ownership of the community, that they are part of a project. That is little things for the project developer that is really, really important for the success of the projects, for the long term in ensuring the long term success of the projects. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think it's clear that successful BlueCarbon and Mangrove projects require both the technical integrity and technical flexibility, but also really strong local partnerships and a participatory approach. And it's great to hear that you're all having success implementing kind of some of these key design principles of the new methodology on the ground. I'm sure we've been receiving a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'm keen now to hear from our audience. Ashwin, I think, will also come back in for this next part to answer any of the really detailed technical questions on our methodology. So bear with me. Let me just pull up the Q&A and we will get to some questions. Ashwin, maybe whilst I'm just looking for the first question to ask here, do you have any questions for our panel before we continue?
Not immediately for the panel. Thanks.
Okay, well, to start with, for you, Karen, you outlined that there are 4 approaches to quantification in the methodology. Which of these can be applied for ex ante estimation?
Within the methodology, the ex ante, you can apply approaches 3 and 4. So that's like using the default values or the local information that you get from the project areas. When it comes to the ex post, it's usually approach 1 and 2 or approach 2. So the higher level of accuracy is somehow encouraged when it comes to doing the ex post. And there's also specific guidelines on how much deduction you can get from the methodology if in case you go beyond the 5%, let's say, uncertainty level. So the methodology already provides this in detail so that project developers, project owners would know exactly okay, this is the existing budget or resources that we have. What can we do during the first verification event, and can we actually transition to let's say a higher tier or higher level onto the next verification event or during the ex post phase of the project. So I would say for ex ante, just to be straight out, it's 3 and 4, and for ex post, it's approach 1 and 2 or approach 2.
Great, thank you. And maybe Dean, just to add on to that, you could maybe touch on how gold standard projects can integrate remote sensing, kind of as the methodology stands currently, in combination with ground truth, kind of forest inventories?
Maybe that's probably a question perhaps better either towards Karen on the mangrove methodology or Ashwin, given it's still an emerging area at Gold Stand. We currently, if we're looking just at AR methodologies, we currently don't have capacity for remote sensing at the moment. So I suggest either going back to Karen in relation to the mangrove methodology or Ashwin for a bigger picture answer on where we're going with that. Not passing the buck, but I think that's the best way to approach it.
Sure, Ashwin, do you want to pick this one up?
Sure, I can jump in. And then, yeah. One key element is that we ought to have a good training data set for remote sensing analysis from either the activity data of the project or from other similar projects which are available in the vicinity. This essentially shall help in having more accurate, data sets and better estimate using RS algos, which will give better models when it comes to estimation of biomass within mangroves. One key challenge for sure has to do with application of RS in SOC, in soil organic carbon within mangroves. And that's one area where it'll be interesting to see if there are any experiences among the project developers or among the scientists and academicians who are here to explore their experience of applying RS datasets on SOC, which is indeed a challenge. So when it comes to the process, the procedures which is allowed as per the methodology right now, as Karen mentioned, these are detailed in the methodology in appendix 1 of the methodology. What exactly would be the steps that will include? And just as a side note, would also like to mention that Gold Standard also allows, or at least is exploring application of RS datasets for a normal forestry project on land, but that's again in the pilot phase, and we'll see the results of that exercise and see whether we could replicate similar exercises for mangroves as well. Karen, if you would like to add anything to that, yeah.
Thanks, Ashwin. Maybe just a short addition. So basically, the sustainable mangrove methodology is actually the starting point that we wanted to initiate or highlight the importance of using existing remote sensing technologies and how it can bridge the existing let's say gap that we have when it comes to using traditional and conventional forest inventory methods. So while this is embedded within sustainable mangrove methodology, as Ashwin mentioned, is still on the, let's say, preparatory phase for the land-based reforestation projects. But one thing that we wanted to highlight, at least within the sustainable mangrove methodologies, that it can be done as long as there's also a certain level of due diligence. So we're not just simply saying just use the satellite images and create your own biomass estimates. We were very explicit in terms of how to do this, how to ensure that the data and parameters that you would get from those analysis are actually credible and robust. So that's one thing that we really devoted a lot of time when we were developing the methodology, just to ensure and also proactively cater it to the VCM in general, that it can be done as long as there's proper due diligence and robust, let's say, steps and quantification available. Yeah.
And just to add on to that question, we just had one in the chat here. Are there specific data sets or models that work best for detecting changes in mangrove coverage? And also in relation to that, the data sets available for demonstrating historical mangrove coverage, and how would a project go about demonstrating that if mangroves were present let's say 100 years ago, and they're not visible in current data sets?
Maybe I could
Yeah,
answer
that would be
that question. That's a very interesting question. Thanks for that. And we did encounter this type of let's say inquiry or clarification when we're actually doing the revisions of the methodology. So what if a project developer has a proposed quote unquote project area, but it has been deforested, let's say 50, 100 years ago. So how can they demonstrate and provide proof that indeed it was a historical mangrove area? So within the methodology, there are two options that we mentioned. But again, emphasizing the flexibility of the methodology, project developers and project owners, we can still, I identify myself as part of project developer sector, so we can still request a gold standard, a deviation from the methodology, if and only we can also provide a robust source of information and that we can demonstrate that this area has been historical in the last 50 or 100 years. I know it sounds very not so plausible given the type and the quality of data that you would find, let's say 50 or even 60 years ago. But there is the flexibility that we can do, and also the two existing options. If you ran out of complying with those two options, you still have the option of the deviation from the methodology that you can request to gold standard, and project developers and project owners would have gold standard would then decide whether those let's say demonstration that indeed they were historical mangrove areas in the past, they will decide whether that could be accepted or not. So eventually, it would be gold standard, I would say, that would decide the credibility of the presented, let's say, evidences.
With that in mind, then, Ashwin, what would you be considering if a deviation like that came across your desk?
Well, difficult to make a comment right now, because each scenario that may come across could be very different. The source of data could be very different. So my suggestion would be to actually reach out to us on a project-to-project basis, and we can evaluate them on a case-to-case basis. We are happy to explore whether any solutions can be looked at or not. But yeah, as Karen pointed out, what we really would want is a very credible trail to the source of this information, and how can it be proved beyond any question that mangroves did exist on land. So yeah, so the evidences provided would be very critical in such cases. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashwin. And one more very quick one for you. I saw that you answered it in the chat, but just so that we mention it here as well. Does the methodology scope include mangrove conservation?
No. So I think during the presentation of the methodology, this methodology essentially involves only reforestation of mangroves, and that too only in those areas, those lands which had mangroves historically. This ensures longevity of the mangrove plantation, reforested mangrove plantation. When we say conservation, it essentially means restoring mangroves in an existing, let us say, degraded mangrove forest, which still falls within the threshold of forest as defined by the host country. So host countries have defined the threshold for a forest in terms of the canopy density and the minimum mapping area, MMU, and as well as the height that a tree can attain at maturity, and these have been submitted to CCC. So as per gold standards requirements, these are the first and foremost requirements which will have to be looked into to look at eligibility of the land where mangrove plantations will be taken up. And mangrove plantations can only be taken up in those areas which are non-forest land. So so conservation, if it is plantation in non-forest land, as per the definition of the host country to UNFCCC, then yes. If conservation includes replantation within which
Oh, I think we lost Ashwin a bit there. Just in case he doesn't come back quickly, maybe we'll quickly move on to another question, which I might pose to you, Natalie. There's a question here about aligning gold standard certification with implementation. So in your experience, how has it been aligning the implementation in terms of tree planting and project start date with the certification cycle? Has there been enough flexibility there in terms of your project registration? And in your experience, what has kind of been the sequence that you've gone about things?
Sure. And by the way, I just mentioned I can't see the Q&A. I'm not sure if it's just me or the other non-gold standard speakers. So in case there's been anything specific. So for us, we have, I will say that we've really been following the gold standard approach. Very early on, we made the decision and knew that we wanted to list the project with gold standard. So we've very much been following gold standard materials and resources in terms of, let's say, like the stages of a project. So our project is going to be a regular project, which means that we haven't started any project activities that will be counted towards our project. We've only done some very small piloting. And so our sequence of events, I think, is this just the kind of standard default that gold standard recommends, as far as my knowledge, which is that we've carried out our local stakeholder consultations. We've done a lot of the work for the design and like the compliance of the project. We've kind of prepared the project in numerous ways, and including putting in place the implementation plan, but we have yet to start the project. And our current next step is listing the project under gold standard, which we're just about ready to do. And yeah, so ours is just regular project in that way.
That's great. Thank you very much. Dean, there's a question here on kind of eligible ecosystems and activities. Is afforestation of mudflats, particularly through mangrove planting, is that an eligible activity? And will this kind of ecosystem be accepted by gold standard? Either you or Ashwin, do you want to take that one?
I can take first stab, and then Ashwin, if you want to jump in. So at the moment, we've actually said mudflats is an ineligible ecosystem. I guess this person that's inquiring could, because I can't see the chat either, could approach gold standard around that concept and explore it a bit more. So whilst in the activity requirements, we have this eligible and non-eligible list. I think somewhere in there we state that where you have a concept that may not fit within that criteria at the moment, reach out to the gold standard to see whether or not it's possible to do something in that space. So I think in terms of afforestation on mudflats, would fall into that category. I wouldn't want to sort of categorically say yes or no at this point in time without further detail. But I'd go to you, Ashwin, and see what you think on that as well.
Thanks. Thanks, Dean. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. So table 1 in section 3 of the activity requirements gives a list of eligible and non-eligible activities. And right now, mudflats would be ineligible activity. I think the question also points out the biodiversity impacts that such an activity can impact. So please do note that any activity undertaken will also have to adhere to safeguarding principles and requirements, especially whether the activity would be taken up in any critical ecosystems or not. And in such cases, there would be additional safeguards which will have to be considered to ensure no harm to the biodiversity in place. So even if it were allowed, there will be other considerations to be made when it comes to critical habitats. Thank you.
And
Great.
maybe just, Tom, just to
Yeah.
add to that, I'd say you couldn't even apply the existing AR methodology in that environment because it would be classified as a wetland, I guess, and at the moment wetlands aren't eligible under the AR methodology. So there isn't currently a methodology. It certainly wouldn't fit under the Sustainable Mangroves methodology. So at the moment there isn't a home for it, but yeah, that's all I just wanted to add that.
Great. Thank you. There's a question here about how to ensure kind of equal access to project areas and ensure that communities have access to all of the livelihood benefits that are associated with mangrove projects. Lalau, how do you ensure that communities understand upfront about how they'll be involved in the project development process and how they'll stand to benefit from the project? What's the kind of process involved in engaging with stakeholders there?
Okay. There are different range of stakeholder, and the main stakeholder is the communities, and the community are consulted from the early stage of a project, from the inception of a project. They are also informed about what would be the benefits that they can get from the project through public consultation, through village meeting, and there is also we conducted like a democratic vote to the community, anonymous, in ensuring that our community have their own voice, not influenced by over, to decide if they would like to go ahead of a project or not. So that is the first step. Communities are also informed, they are consulted, they are empowered to make a decision on the projects, in ensuring that the project is from community needs, but not imposed by the project implementer. And the community were given enough time to think, to make an informed decision about the projects. And the stakeholder is not only community, but there are like different range of community, like local authorities, like elder in the village, the different range of communities group, like fishers, loggers, youth, women who are sometimes marginalized, and we are ensuring that everyone has a voice on the project. And the project activity is always decided with in consultation with the local communities through village meeting. So the decision is always from the communities, including the benefits like what they would like to use from the revenue. They would like maybe to build a school from the carbon revenue, or they would like to pay school fees of the school children from the carbon revenues, or yeah, it depends on the community decision. But the role of the project developer is only to provide, like to present and present the opportunities from the carbon projects, and provide advice to the community, but the decision is on the hands of the local community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it just stresses really the importance of that participatory approach, not just for the permanence of the project, but also for the livelihood benefits that will arise from it. I think we maybe have time for just one question before we close things up. Ashwin, this one will go to you. Does the methodology allow integrated mangrove aquaculture projects, as in planting mangrove ponds that are actively being used for aquacultural production?
I believe the methodology is rather silent about other activities which could be considered within the project area. So for example, let us say for ensuring livelihood of the community residing by the mangrove plantation area, there are activities taken up within the project. Those will have to undergo the assessment of drivers, and whether it will have an impact on the existing plantation. That will be the bottom line, and the methodology is rather silent on eligibility of any other activities being taken up within mangrove area. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think with that last question, that brings us to the end of today's discussion. It's been really valuable to hear perspectives from the ground on the importance of community engagement and how the methodology can translate into action. I also hope everyone's excited, like I am, to see which other methodologies will be developed under the BlueCarbon and freshwater activity requirements. And if you have any interest in developing new methodologies, please take a look at our methodology development procedure. And then, of course, a huge thank you to our panelists, Karen, Dean, Lalau, and Natalie, for sharing their expertise. And thank you for our audience for engaging with the Q&A. We'll share a recording and the slides after the webinar, and also respond to any questions that we didn't get the chance to cover. So once again, thank you for your time today, and we look forward to continuing these discussions on the vital role of BlueCarbon and freshwater wetland ecosystems. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.